Good evening. My name is Bahar Ghosh. I'm sure I've seen many of you here at Jefferson. Tonight, as you can see, we are doing this differently. We're doing this remotely. We're doing this online. We're streaming live on Facebook. Hopefully you can access the PowerPoint presentation. I know Ben has posted it earlier today. So if you can't see the screen very well through the, camera, you can follow us on the presentation that's posted on Facebook. I am a professor at Edinburgh University. I teach geography, economic, cultural, political geography in the Middle East. And today we'll be focusing on Afghanistan. When and how will our longest war end? When and how will America's longest war end? Start with simple geography, location of Afghanistan. Afghanistan has geostrategic location. It serves as a buffer between Central Asia and the former Soviet sphere of influence, South Asia and the former British sphere of influence, and the Middle East. So it's right in the middle between Central Asia, West Asia, and South Asia. So obviously it borders on many different countries. It does share a border with China, with Tajikistan, with Uzbekistan, with Turkmenistan, with Iran, and with Pakistan. This will get to be important when we talk about the population diversity. Afghanis have many different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds. Afghanistan has been, the center of what historians refer to as the Great Game. We have this competition between the Russians and the British for influence in Afghanistan. So it served as a buffer between the Russian sphere of influence and the British sphere of influence. Late in the 20th century, it became the battleground for the Cold War between the Soviet Union on one hand and the United States and our allies on the other hand. So a conflict that drew in the Russians, the Soviets, the United States, and our allies in the Middle East. Unfortunately, it seems like as soon as the war ended, we washed our hands from Afghanistan and left. So we left Afghanistan to its own devices, and that's where the problem emerged. So the United States was eager to leave as soon as the Soviets were defeated and forced to withdraw from the region. We left as well, and Afghanistan fell into a bloody civil war that lasted many years, eventually ended with the rise of the Taliban, who managed to control about 90% of the country. So the Taliban were our allies, in many ways were our creation, and eventually became our enemies and our problem. Unfortunately, Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world. It has been in a state of war dating back to 1979, so we've had 40 years of war. So the economy of the country, the infrastructure has been devastated. Millions of Afghans became refugees, sought refuge in Pakistan and in Iran. It's a landlocked country that has suffered from war devastation and neglect for over 4 decades. So we'll come back to this. We'll see that by any measure, Afghanistan stands out as one of the poorest countries in the world, one of the least developed countries in the world. So yes, it has attracted a lot of attention because of its geostrategic location, acting as the buffer between West Asia or the Middle East on one hand, Central Asia and the former Soviet Republic, and South Asia, the British sphere of influence. Afghanistan is characterized by harsh topography. So we have rugged and forbidding mountains and terrains. It does look beautiful. We can see some of the landscapes here. Again, mountains dominate the country. Get a lot of snow in the mountains, and that's why in many cases we see the spring offensive. So every winter we had a basically de facto ceasefire because of the weather, because of climate, and then in the spring the conflict is resumed. So we see that this is Kabul, the capital city, and the mountains in the backyard, in the background. So we have a lot of mountains and harsh terrain in the region. When we say Afghanis, Afghanistan is one of those countries that was an artificial state. And what we mean by that is a country that was created without much regard to history, to ethnic, tribal, and linguistic diversity. So Afghanistan is a multinational state, includes many different national groups that, if given a choice, would not have wanted to be together. Afghanistan has been influenced by Islam since the Arab invasion. So the Arabs invaded Afghanistan and helped convert the population from Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Hinduism to Islam. The country is very diverse, as we were just saying, ethnically, linguistically, and tribally. This diversity of population is one of the main factors behind the conflict we find in the region now and we found in the region in the 1990s. The single largest group are the Pashtuns. We want to keep in mind that this is the largest group, but they don't form a majority. The Pashtuns are divided almost equally in number between Afghanistan and Pakistan. They see themselves as distinct and separate, and the Vice President Biden correctly, I guess, indicated that much of the conflict in Iraq and in Afghanistan could have been averted, maybe resolved, if we created nation states. So this concept was introduced earlier in the 20th century, but has never been implemented in the Middle East. So in Afghanistan, we have the Pashtun, we have the Tajik, we have the Hazara, we have the Uzbek, we have the Uyghur, we have the Turkmen, and we have other groups. So we see a great deal of overlap in terms of ethnic linguistic groups in Afghanistan and in neighboring countries. So we see Pashtun in Pakistan, Afghanistan. We see Tajik in Tajikistan and Afghanistan. We see Hazara, basically Farsi speakers in Iran and in Afghanistan. The same thing with the Uyghur, Turkmen, and other groups. So when we look at the map here, we can see that we have many different ethno-linguistic groups. We can see that the Pashtun mark the single largest group, and we see that the Pashtun tribes live on both sides of the border, separating Pakistan and Afghanistan. They have never accepted these superimposed boundaries. But we see a large number of Tajik, small minorities of Uzbek, of Turkmen, of Hazara, and other smaller groups, the Baluch and other smaller groups. So again, we can see from this map that the political divisions do not correspond to the ethnic, linguistic, and tribal divisions. So a country of minorities living together, many different groups that have different affiliation and different loyalties. So when we look at the map that shows the languages of Afghanistan, I want us to focus on the southern part of Afghanistan, so 18, 22, 27, 15, 11. This is where we have the Pashtun, and of course they speak Pashto. This is the single largest group in Afghanistan. In terms of number, about 42% of Afghanis belong to this group, the Pashtun. In the north, we have Uzbek and Turkmen. On the borders of Iran, we have the Hazara. They speak Dari or Persian, a dialect of Persian. So we have the Baluch in the extreme southwest of the country. Again, they share the same ethnic and linguistic heritage as the Baluch in both Pakistan and in Iran. So very diverse country in terms of ethnic and linguistic groups. The Pashtun mark the largest group. And the Pashtun are important for us because the Pashtun is where most of the Taliban, the group that we have been fighting for the past 19 years, come from. So the Pashtun, then we have the Tajik, the Hazara, the Uzbek, the Turkmen, the Baluch. The Tajik, the Uzbek, and the Turkmen live in the north, close to these former Soviet republics, and they, I guess, constitute what came to be known as the Northern Alliance, the group that was opposed to the Taliban. So we have the Pashtun, the Taliban, then we have the ethnic minorities in the north, Tajik, Uzbek, Turkmen, that form the Northern Alliance. The vast majority of Afghanis are Muslim, about 80% are Sunni Muslims, 19% are Shia Muslims. So the official name of Afghanistan is the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Has a relatively large population and a rapidly growing population. On average, an Afghani woman would give birth to 7 children. So we have 7 children per family, one of the fastest population growth in the entire world. Again, many different languages are spoken here, but the 2 main languages are Pashto, the language of the Pashtun tribe, and Dari, the main language of the Hazara, a dialect of Farsi or Persian. You will notice that life expectancy is relatively low, about 48 years, but that's a remarkable improvement over life expectancy of 40 years, which I guess is what life expectancy was like for Afghanis just over a decade ago. In terms of exports, Afghanistan exports some agricultural crops. The main cash crop for Afghanistan is opium. Afghanistan has been and continues to be the largest producer of opium. We'll come back to this because that plays an important role in the conflict in the country. So we said Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world. We can see that when we look at food security or food insecurity. Much of Afghanistan is food insecure. So all of these areas in darker shades are food insecure. The majority of Afghanis don't get adequate food. Afghanistan has one of the lowest literacy rate in the world. Enormous disparities between male and female literacy rate. We can see that literacy rate overall is low, but remarkably low for women. Different studies put the number at, I guess, have different numbers, but literacy rate for adult women is about 21%. Again, one of the lowest in the world. Men are higher, but still, the majority of men are illiterate. The United Nations ranks all world countries on the scale of development called the Human Development Index. This index looks at income, looks at life expectancy, and looks at literacy. And Afghanistan has one of the lowest incomes in the world, certainly in Asia, has one of the lowest life expectancy in the entire world, and has one of the lowest literacy, certainly female literacy. So when we compare Afghanistan to the poorest countries in the world, if we look at child mortality rate, Afghanistan mortality rate is double what you find in the poorest countries in the world. About 4 times as high as the rest of the world. We see the same thing with the maternal mortality rate. 1 in 7 women die giving birth. So that's a very high number, more than double the world's average. And again, we said life expectancy is very low compared even to the poorest countries in the world. The Taliban, the term Taliban is actually an Arabic term. Talib means student, Taliban means religious students. Those religious students basically were brainwashed in religious schools called madrasas. Those madrasas were established by Saudi clerks, funded by Saudi money, and they were established in neighboring Pakistan. So that's where we recruited freedom fighters, or mujahideen. The Holy Book of Islam, the Quran, is in Arabic. Most of the Taliban speak Pashto. Most of them cannot even read Pashto. The Quran is written in classical Arabic, so it's very difficult even for Arabs to understand it. So how would illiterate Afghanis who speak Pashto understand their own religion? They don't. They are dependent on Saudi religious leaders to interpret it for them. And they interpreted the Saudi way, the Wahhabi way. So that's what led to their radicalization. So literacy is low overall for the entire population, but most of those freedom fighters were illiterate. 90% of the Taliban were illiterate, literally did not know what their religion says. They were taught to memorize the Quran, but had no idea what it said, did not understand the meaning of their holy book. So we can see the enormous variation in literacy rate. We have different numbers. Some outside experts put adult female literacy rate at 5%. Some generously put it as high as 21%. Either way, it's very low. So education is a problem in Afghanistan. The United States has invested millions of dollars trying to build schools for women after the liberation of Afghanistan, but Afghanistan continues to lag well behind the rest of the world. Let's get to modern history. We can go back to the mid-18th century when Afghanistan was unified and was established as a buffer between the British and the Russian spheres of influence. The British had some influence in the country, but in 1919, Afghanistan became independent and enjoyed a brief period of democracy. That brief period ended with a coup in 1973, and in 1978 we have a communist counter-coup. So again, we have British and Russians or Soviets competing for influence going back centuries. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to support the Afghani communist or socialist regime. And this led to, I guess, the Cold War taking place on Afghani soil. So the United States and its allies supported the rebels, again, the Mujahideen, freedom fighters. And the Soviet troops were targeted by these Mujahideen who were provided with missiles, weapons, training, and ideology. Again, the Wahhabi ideology from Saudi Arabia. Once the Soviets were driven out of Afghanistan, we have a civil war between the different factions in Afghanistan itself, and that resulted in the emergence of the Taliban. The Taliban managed to control about 90% of the country, and initially many in Afghanistan welcomed their rule because they provided some law and order. They ended this anarchy that marked the country for years. 9/11, the terrorist attacks of 9/11 led the United States and our allies to take action. We were helped by Afghanis that did not support the Taliban, the Northern Alliance, who were fighting the Taliban. So they served as our boots on the ground, and the Taliban were toppled. They were toppled because they helped shelter Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. So again, we have this Cold War between the Soviets and the United States and allies. And then we had this bloody civil war in Afghanistan, which led to the emergence of the Taliban. The Taliban are basically the creation of this unholy alliance between the United States, which provided the weapons and intelligence, Saudi Arabia, which provided the ideology and funding for religious schools, the madrasas, and Pakistan, which provided the training grounds for the rebels. So we have this unholy alliance between the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. We shared one common goal. We wanted the Soviets out of Afghanistan. We wanted to defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan. So we provided the weapons and the intelligence. Saudi Arabia provided this rigid, radical interpretation of Islam, Wahhabism, the Wahhabi ideology, the Salafi ideology. Again, this is where the concept of jihad and the issue of mujahideen, or freedom fighters, emerged. And Pakistan provided the training grounds. So we see Afghanistan became a battleground in the Cold War. We need to remember that during that time, we had many allies, including many Saudi allies, many Saudi volunteers, and one of those Saudi volunteers was Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was our ally. So once the Afghani rebels, resistance movement, won the war, and the Afghanis were defeated, the Russians were defeated and forced out of the country. We see the country, I guess, fall into a civil war. So important for this concept of Cold War between the United States and allies and the Soviet Union is the emergence of what came to be known as the Arab volunteers, or Afghani Arabs. Foreign fighters who were convinced it's their religious duty to go to Afghanistan to wage war and to fight the infidels, the atheists, the communists. So this is the group that gave rise to Al-Qaeda and to Osama bin Laden. So to summarize what we have discussed, we got the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, we got the US, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia supporting the Afghani rebels, helping to defeat the Russians in Afghanistan, and we see the collapse of the Afghani communist government. The Mujahideen, the rebels, seized control. We had a civil war for a few years, and eventually this led to the rise of the Taliban. The Taliban provided shelter. Afghanistan became home for many radical groups, including Al-Qaeda, and that's where the 9/11 attacks were planned and engineered. So after 9/11, the United States intervened militarily, and we helped end the Taliban regime. The United States, our NATO allies, assumed responsibility for maintaining security in Afghanistan, and we can see that we actually chose and imposed a president on Afghanistan. Hamid Karzai was elected president. All of the Afghani presidential elections have been marred by fraud, have been contested. So whether we're talking about Hamid Karzai, about Ashraf Ghani, the current president, so whether we're talking about 2004, 2009, 2014, or 2019, all of these elections have been contested and not fair or free, at least from a majority of Afghanis. That's how they view them. So we've had a country devastated by war, over 4 decades of war. The numbers of dead in Afghanistan has a wide range, 100,000 at the low end to over 2 million at the high end. About 1 in 4 Afghanis fled to Pakistan, and a few million more sought refuge in Iran. So we have about 7 million Afghanis became refugees in neighboring countries, in the 2 main neighboring countries. Pakistan in the east, Iran in the west. At one time, half of all refugees in the world were Afghanis. In addition to those that were killed and displaced, we have over 1 million, 1.2 million Afghanis that were disabled, 3 million that were maimed, and most of these were civilians. The infrastructure of Afghanistan was destroyed, so irrigation systems, highways, hospitals were destroyed. So this hampered Afghanistan's ability to get back on its feet. It didn't help that after this devastating war, we had a civil war. And then after the civil war, we have the United States invasion of Afghanistan. So we can see Kandahar, once the second largest city in the country, so its population decreased from 200,000 to 25,000. Again, the Russians did not worry about civilian casualties, so they carpet bombed the region. Anywhere they thought they have rebels, they relied on airstrikes. And of course, at that time, they didn't have smart weapons, smart bombs, or laser-directed missiles. What gave rise to the 9/11 attacks is this emergence among especially the Afghani Arabs that felt that they and their Afghani Mujahideen brothers defeated the Soviets. So the Islamists concluded at the end of the war that they were the main reason that the Soviet Union collapsed. They brought a superpower to its knees, and the United States basically had very limited role. So the rise of the Taliban led to a rise of Islamism in Afghanistan. So a country that used to be socialist, allied with the Soviet Union, became a fundamentalist Islamist country. So of course, following the 9/11 attack, the United States took swift action, and we have Operation Enduring Freedom. The war in Afghanistan started in October 7, 2001, and now we're on the 19th year of war. We have been trying to end that war, but we started the war with our British allies. We included our NATO allies, but we've been at war for over 19 years. So again, we relied heavily on the Northern Alliance, the non-Pashtun minorities in the north, to be our boots on the ground. And the non-Pashtuns became very influential in the post-Taliban Afghani regime. So we helped install Hamid Karzai as president, but the government was and continues to be heavily controlled by ethnic minorities from the north, the Tajik, the Uzbek, the Northern Alliance. The Taliban resorted to guerrilla tactics and have been using mostly suicide bombing and IEDs to attack US and NATO troops. The reason I have this map here is because I wanted us to see what provinces we had the most difficulty with, where we had most of the fighting. And I wanted us to look at not just the provinces of Afghanistan, but where the Pashtuns live. And if you look at the area in green, where we had most of the battles between us and the Taliban, and we look at the concentration of Pashtun population, we can see that there's a very close correspondence between the two. So again, those in the north are Turkic minorities that allied with us. Those in the south are Pashtun tribes that have been fighting us from the beginning. They provided most of the Taliban fighters. Following the war in 2001, millions of Afghani refugees returned home. So we can see a large number, about 2 million returned in 2002, an additional maybe 4 to 5 million returned in the following 5 years. The problem we have in Afghanistan is we have a government that doesn't have any power base, doesn't enjoy majority support, and is heavily dependent on the non-Pashtun minorities, the Uzbek, the Tajik, the Turkmen, the Northern Alliance. So what we have now is renewed competition in Afghanistan, but instead between Russia and the British, today it's between India, Pakistan, China, Iran, of course the United States, Russia, and other countries. We said all of the elections in Afghanistan have been flawed. So we sent international monitors, and international monitors told us that these elections were fraud, were flawed, and were a fraud. So Karzai was elected twice. Then we have Ashraf Ghani elected twice. The last election was disputed, and we ended up with 2 presidents. 2 candidates claim that they have won the presidency. So this will complicate our mission in the next, I guess, phase in Afghanistan. We said Afghanistan used to produce opium, but opium production has increased dramatically, as we can see from the graph, following the liberation of Afghanistan. So let's look at the number in 2001. 2001 was the lowest year for opium production in Afghanistan. And look what happened in the next few years. We have a dramatic increase in opium production. The warlords in Afghanistan, those militia leaders, rely heavily on opium to support their militias. So this is their main cash crop. That's how they fund their armies and militias. So we can see a lot of poppy cultivation, especially in the southern provinces, the areas where we have the Pashtun. Don't have as much poppy production in the north. So we can see, again, a close correspondence between the map where we have the fighting, the map where we have a heavy concentration of Pashtun, and the map where we have poppy cultivation. So again, a link between security, Pashtun concentrations, and poppy production, or opium production. So what does the future have for Afghanistan? We've been trying for, I guess, over a decade to end the conflict. Hamid Karzai tried to appease the moderate Taliban. The United States tried to reach out to the Taliban on different occasions. President Obama thought that if we could break the back of the Taliban, they would come to the negotiating table. So he increased the US troops in Afghanistan 3 different times. And finally, we decided maybe we can't make Afghanistan into a Jeffersonian democracy. Instead, the best we can hope for is a stable Afghanistan. So we have moved from hoping for a democratic, Western-style democracy into a stable Afghanistan. So we've seen different presidents in the United States reach out to Taliban leaders. We tried to use our allies in the Middle East, in Dubai, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in Pakistan to reach out to the Taliban, but most of these have not yielded results. A peace conference in London also did not lead to any breakthrough. So the different attempts by Karzai, by the United States, by our allies in the region, resulted in no breakthroughs. Many, I guess, worry that Afghanistan might become a failed state. I think that train has left the station. Afghanistan is already a failed state. So if we look at what our military leaders, and I guess recent reports have shown us that They have been presenting us with a relatively rosy picture. Situation in Afghanistan is a lot worse than they led us to believe. And certainly David Petraeus is one of the few voices that told us about the problems and challenges we face in Afghanistan. Much more complicated than what we faced in Iraq. So what's the problem in Afghanistan? We really don't know what we want, what's our objective. We don't have much coordination, and certainly we don't have local partners. Hamid Karzai, the president of Afghanistan, was referred to as the mayor of Kabul. He had no power and no influence outside of the capital city. President Obama, I guess, changed our approach, and this gave rise to what came to be known as the AFPAC strategy. Afghanistan and Pakistan as one theater of operation, and we cannot resolve Afghanistan without Pakistan's help. But Pakistan has been one of those frenemies. On one hand, they support us sometimes. On the other hand, they have been supporting the Taliban and other rebel groups, other terrorist groups from our perspective. We have built massive military bases in the region. This led many in Afghanistan and around the world to think that we will be there to stay for many, many years to come. So Kandahar airfield, Bagram Air Base, we have massive military bases in the region. And we have invested a lot of blood and treasure. Thousands of Americans have been killed, injured, maimed, and we have spent over $1 trillion on the war effort. We said President Obama decided on this break the back of the Taliban and force them into the negotiating table. So increase the troop levels to 142,000. He thought a defeated Taliban would come to the table and would be happy with whatever we offer them, especially if we can build the Afghani military and slowly give them more responsibility for security in their own country. That has not happened, unfortunately. We were hoping to be able to accomplish this in about 5 years, right before the end of the Obama term. That has not happened. So we still don't have a viable Afghani military. The Taliban has not been broken, and we're still, I guess, stuck in Afghanistan. Our NATO allies were eager to leave. They liked this idea of leaving by 2015. We're already in 2020, and we're far from leaving. Everybody, I guess, who's familiar with the situation would tell us that there is no military solution to the conflict. The conflict will end when we reach accommodation with the Taliban, with the enemy. And that will happen only if the Afghani government and the Taliban share power. So when we have a change in administration and President Trump came to office, he also had similar ideas. So what President Trump said, my original instinct was to pull out, to withdraw American troops from Afghanistan. I do like my instincts. That's what he thought. He wanted American troops out of Afghanistan, just like Obama did. But he told us that he arrived at 3 fundamental conclusions. We must seek an honorable and enduring outcome, an outcome that reflects the tremendous sacrifices we made in blood and treasure. So we must provide our troops with everything that they need to win, and then reach a peace settlement. He also went on to say that we cannot leave hastily. A hasty withdrawal would create a vacuum for terrorists. Again, remember, part of the problem we had is we were too eager to leave Afghanistan. Once the Soviets and the Russians were forced out of the country, we left. And we left Afghanistan to its own devices, and that led to the Taliban regime and to Afghanistan becoming a haven for terrorists. So we want to avoid repeating the same mistake. Third, we want to make sure that Afghanistan will never again become a haven for terrorists. And given the fact that Afghanistan and Pakistan are one theater of operation, this theater of operation has the highest concentration of terrorist groups anywhere in the world. So we cannot allow Afghanistan or the Afghan region to become a haven for terrorists. So when President Trump came, he followed basically the Obama strategy, shock and awe. So for the first time, we used the mother of all bombs that could destroy an entire mountain, massive bombs. He increased the troop levels by 4,000, just like Obama did, increased it to 142,000. And we started to embed American troops and Afghani troops. So this is the mix of what we call the blue, American NATO troops, and the green, the Afghani troops. They didn't always work too well. And the goal is to seek an honorable exit, peace negotiations, peace settlement with moderate Taliban. Again, we have many different Taliban: Pakistani Taliban, Afghani Taliban, moderate Taliban, extremist Taliban. So our goal has shifted from a democratic Afghanistan to simply a stable, secure Afghanistan. President Obama has been working behind the scenes to reach a peace agreement. Last year on 9/11, he had invited a delegation from the Taliban to come to the White House to sign a tentative peace agreement. Ironically, they were supposed to visit on 9/11. Given that the optics were very bad, he used the excuse that the Taliban killed one American serviceman to cancel the ceremony and suspend the talks. So again, just think about that. The Taliban in the White House on 9/11. We have been trying to negotiate with the Taliban behind the scenes, and our allies in the Middle East, especially Qatar, have been working. This agreement basically has main elements. The first, all US troops will be withdrawn from Afghanistan in 2 phases. In 14 months, all American and allied troops would leave Afghanistan. In the first phase, we would have about a third of American troops leave the region. So US troop presence would be reduced to 8,600 in the first 4.5 months. And then the remaining troops will withdraw in the next 9 months. We also agreed that the Afghani government will release 5,000 Taliban prisoners. In exchange, the Taliban will release 1,000 Afghani security forces that they hold as prisoners. One minor problem here: we never involved the Afghani government in the negotiations. We never consulted them. So 2 weeks after we signed this agreement, the Afghani government refused to release the prisoners. And the Taliban refused to do anything until the prisoners are released. So point number 1, withdrawal of troops and releasing of prisoners, we have problems with. The Taliban commit to end support for all terrorist organizations. We decide who the terrorist organization is. Again, we have about 20 different organizations that we label as terrorist organization in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Again, some of these are organizations that are considered rebels, freedom fighters. So the Haqqani Network. Is the Haqqani Network a terrorist organization or a Mujahideen organization? The two sides agreed to maintain communication channels to resolve any issues. Again, our friends in Qatar would help facilitate this communication. The other big element here is intra-party talks between and among Afghanis. So the Afghani government will be negotiating with the Taliban to share power. So they will slowly negotiate to include the Taliban in the government. And they would agree to a long-term ceasefire. So initially the ceasefire was going to last a few weeks, so we have a reduction of hostilities. Then we will have a long-term ceasefire and power sharing. Many in Afghanistan were shocked that the Afghani government was not included in negotiations and that different groups, including Afghani women, were not involved in negotiations. So some feel that the Afghanis were thrown under the bus. Afghani women especially worry about the resurgence of the Taliban and what that means for their everyday life. So this is the current Afghani president. He won a second term last year. But as you can read here, we can see that he declared himself the winner in the elections that were held in September. But his rival, Abdullah, also claimed that he won the election. So Afghanistan now has two presidents. Which of the two presidents will be negotiating with? Who's the rightful president? So this division within the government of Afghanistan might complicate the issue of negotiating with the Taliban, the implementation of the peace agreement that we have reached. We said many Afghanis were shocked that they were not included in the negotiations. This is especially disturbing to Afghani women. Afghanistan did not have many restrictions on women when they had a socialist government in the 1970s and 80s. Once the Taliban took control of the government, Afghanistan went back to the Stone Age. That certainly is the situation for women. So let's take a look at some facts. Again, many Afghani women die giving birth. 79% of Afghani women are illiterate, adult women are illiterate. Only 1 in 3 girls have access to education. 1 in 3 Afghani women experience physical, psychological, and sexual violence. We have very low life expectancy. That's low for men and for women, but for women it's slightly lower. And about 80% of all women in Afghanistan are forced into marriage. A marriage that their father usually negotiates with the father of the groom. The couple never get to see each other before wedding night. Of course, literacy rate is one of those shocking facts. When we look at Afghanistan and we look at literacy rate in Afghanistan and compare it to literacy rate in the neighboring countries, again, Afghanis share, links and kinship with all of the neighboring countries, in Pakistan, in Tajikistan, in Uzbekistan, in Turkmenistan, and in Iran. So in Afghanistan, female literacy rate is 21%. In Iran, it's over 90%. It's 97% in Turkmenistan, 99% in Tajikistan, 96% in Uzbekistan. They share the same religion, they share the same language, they share the same culture. What's different? What's different is the Taliban have accepted the Saudi interpretation of Islam, a radical interpretation that the vast majority of Muslims reject. So unfortunately, that's what the Taliban forced women to do. And you can notice from the date here that this is Afghani women dressed in burqas after the liberation of Afghanistan. So in many rural areas, women still have to cover from head to toe. That's what Afghani women in the urban centers worry. Will that be imposed upon them if the Taliban control the government? Again, women are not allowed to work, so this documentary won the Best Foreign Oscar because a young girl who could not work outside the house pretended to be a man so she could work and support her family after the death of her father. Many women are targeted because they call for women's rights, for equality. So again, if they don't accept the limitations and restrictions that the Taliban impose on them, sometimes they are targeted by rebel groups and the Taliban. So what would the future hold for Afghanistan? Will women in Afghanistan dress as they do on the upper left side or on the lower right side? Is the future a bright future for Afghani women, or are they doomed to go under the rule of the Taliban, restricted in their movement, forced to wear the burqa anytime they leave the house? We have, I guess, a couple of videos that might shed some light on Afghanistan if anybody's interested. Now, I guess we will be able to entertain some questions. Hopefully, some of you have been following us, and I'm sure you have many questions and comments.
Yes, there are some questions for those of you who are with us. I am Farki Faradi. I am going to conduct some of the Q&A here. So staying in the subject of women, one of the watchers here is saying that, of course, United States of America should continue to honor women's rights all across the globe. What I presume here is a question from one of our team members because it's posted from the Jefferson account. Question. Women and girls are particularly vulnerable to extremists. What difference would it make to strengthen women's position in Afghan society? Would it make it more dangerous, or could it help in the peace process? And what role can the U.S. play?
It's a very good question. Obviously, we certainly don't want to see women go backwards. They have gained more access to education. They have more and more women working, and women actually control 1/3 of parliamentary seats. I think the United States should insist that that should continue to happen. Women, if they are at the negotiating table, can certainly secure and preserve their rights. They should be part of the government coalition. So if the Taliban get to control a certain percentage of parliamentary seats, have a certain ministries, women should control some ministries and should continue to have adequate representation. Clearly, I guess 1/3 of the parliamentary seats is a dramatic improvement over what they had. They had zero power before. The Taliban have assured us that from their perspective, Islam provides for equality of women. That's a very different interpretation from what they had presented in the 1990s. But maybe we can condition our aid to Afghanistan on the government preserving women's rights, abiding by the agreement that they strike with us and with the Afghani government.
Wonderful. Thank you again. You are still watching this. Again, the PowerPoint is posted on our Facebook page. One of our regulars is asking, how has the influence of the state religion affected the education levels, economic stability, and the well-being of the people? Is there a state religion?
If you look at the official name of Afghanistan, I will go back to this. The full name of Afghanistan is the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. 99% of Afghanis are Muslim. But that was also the case when Afghanistan had a socialist government. And under that socialist government, women had very little restrictions on their ability to get an education, to get a job, or to move around. So, does religion constrain women? It depends on what interpretation of Islam you have. So again, that's why we looked at the Afghanistan and all of the neighboring countries, because we wanted to show that even though Afghanistan is a Muslim country, most of the neighbors are also Muslim. So when we look at all of these countries in the region, we'll see that Afghanistan is bordered by Iran, by Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Pakistan. All of these countries have much higher literacy rates, even though they are all Muslim countries. So it's not religion, it's the abuse of religion that led to the oppression of women. So when we look at literacy rate for countries neighboring to Afghanistan, we can see the difference. All of these countries are Muslim majority countries. We can see that literacy rate for women are remarkably higher. So what we need is for Afghanistan to abandon this Wahhabi interpretation of Islam and adopt the Uzbek or Turkmen or Tajik interpretation of Islam, the mainstream interpretation of Islam.
Before we move to some of the other questions, we have a question here. Can you again tell us the difference and the similarities between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda?
The Taliban and Al-Qaeda were again linked by this Wahhabi interpretation of Islam. Al-Qaeda is made up of non-Afghanis. Al-Qaeda is made up primarily of what we call Afghani Arabs, Arab volunteers that went to Afghanistan to fight the infidels, the Soviets, the Russians, the atheists. The Taliban are drawn primarily from the largest Afghani group, the Pashtun. So they are Afghanis, the Taliban. They were educated in madrasas, religious schools, and they were brainwashed into this Wahhabi ideology that came from Saudi Arabia. The Al-Qaeda, again from the name, the base, is an organization established by Arab volunteers that went to Afghanistan to fight the Russians. So we have an Afghani troop and we have an Al-Qaeda group. The thing they have in common is they share the same radical interpretation of Islam.
Thank you, Doctor. All right, another question here. It says, sounds like the new peace plan was a U.S. talking point, as the Afghan government was not involved in the plan. No prisoner release, no Taliban cooperation. What do you make of that?
Well, I would unfortunately agree with that conclusion, because it's hard to see how you can make peace if you don't involve the Afghani government. We have committed them to releasing the prisoners. We didn't even consult them with that. And of course, one of the problems we have is what Afghani government are we talking about? Are we talking about Ghani as the president, or are we talking about Abdullah as the president? We have two presidents in Afghanistan now. Who's really the president? And will that president have much influence in the rest of the country?
Are they both in Kabul?
Yes, and again, they don't have much influence in the Pashtun region. Mm-hmm. The government is dominated by the Northern Alliance, the other minority groups, the Turkic minorities, the Uzbek, the Tajik, the Turkmen from the north.
Mm-hmm. So, paint a picture of what Kabul is like for us.
Well, I mean, I've never been to Kabul, but based on what I read and I see, I guess, in the coverage, for the most part, it's desperately poor, has poor infrastructure, but Kabul is still much better off than the rest of the country. And where we have the foreign embassies and foreigners, this is similar to what we had in Baghdad, where we had the green zone, relatively safe area. Ironically, since you raised this question, when the president was sworn in just, I guess, a week ago, while he was being sworn in the safest part of Afghanistan, they had explosions all over the place, and his desk was shaking, but he continued with his speech because he wanted to show power, perseverance. But you could see that on TV. So if you go back to the inauguration of President Ghani and look at the coverage of that, while he was being sworn in, we had bombs throughout the region. So the Taliban and the Pashtun can get to Kabul, and we often hear about, unfortunately, some American and NATO troops that are targeted in the capital city, which is the safest part of Afghanistan, and in the green zone, which is the safest part of Kabul.
I have a question myself in terms of this thing that's going on globally, the pandemic, the COVID-19. Obviously, these third world countries don't have the capacity to deal with this. So what do you make of it? Is it pretty much it's going to be with us for a very, very long time and stay alive in places like Afghanistan?
Well, this is the main concern that many health experts have, is if you get into poor third world countries, and Afghanistan, again, is one of the poorest countries in the world, they don't really have an adequate health infrastructure. They can't deal with even simple health conditions. So if the coronavirus, COVID-19, gets to Afghanistan, it's going to have a devastating effect, because many of these people basically live in one room. You have a family of 10 living in one room, eating from a communal bowl. They sleep in the same room. So if one of them is sick, the entire family is going to get sick. And then the entire village is going to get sick. And unfortunately, they don't have the resources. They don't have the infrastructure to deal with it. So this could be devastating for countries like Afghanistan. And we've seen what happened in the Yemen war. Again, devastating.
All right, well, we're going to end up with a question here by somebody who seems to have read quite a bit of history about Afghanistan, because they've seen a pattern. The question is, what power, not including the U.S., do you think will be the next to engage militarily in Afghanistan in the future?
Well, as we mentioned, I guess we refer to Afghanistan as the graveyard of empires, going back to the Greeks, the British, the Russians. I would think the biggest rivalry today is the Cold War between Pakistan and India. India has gained a lot of influence in Afghanistan, and that's one of the main reasons why Pakistan and the ISI, the Pakistani secret police and intelligence services, has been supporting the Taliban. Pakistan is determined not to allow India to have so much influence in Afghanistan. So I could see Pakistan getting even much more heavily involved in Afghanistan if and when we leave. If we leave a vacuum, the Pakistanis will try to fill it. They resent the fact that they have helped defeat the Russians. They provided the training grounds for the Mujahideen, and now India is gaining so much influence. So for them, they would not allow that to happen. So I can see Pakistan making that mistake. And again, they have a large Pashtun population that supports the Pashtuns on the other side of the border. So I guess next conflict will be a Cold War or a hot war between Afghanis who are supported by India and Afghanis who are supported by Pakistan.
But we know for sure it's not going to be the Russians.
The Russians, hopefully, they've learned their lesson and they're not coming back.
Thank you, Dr. Gaucher. Thanks, everybody, for joining us on this Facebook Live. Stay tuned for more programming in the coming days, weeks, and months. Thank you.
Thank you all. Good night.